Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this fortnight we're going to talk about It's Chapter 2, the sequel to, funnily enough, It's Chapter 1, the latest version of the famous clown horror story, which I believe we covered in our very first new format episode. So we've somehow come full circle, I guess, in but we're still going. And then we will be asking, how do you cram a novel into a film? We'll tell you later. But first, Alastair, what else have you been imbibing this fortnight?
So I've gone back and revisited something that we reviewed way back in the old format when we were recommending things to each other. And I believe you recommended me a comic called Descender.
I did.
Yes, you did. And it was very good. It's written by Jeff Lemire and it's drawn by Dustin Nguyen. It's a science fiction comic set in a sort of unspecified far future when humanity sort of lives scattered across sort of like 7 worlds in a sort of spacefaring civilization and some large robots. The other thing to say is that, they're served by a wide range of robots that do everything from kind of mining work to domestic chores. And then some very, very large robots turn up out of nowhere and kind of wreak destruction upon civilization very quickly and then vanish. And then the majority of the comic takes place 10 years after that when a group of people are investigating the origin of these giant robots known as the Harvesters and whether they're likely to return. And the secret to this could be wrapped up in a robot called Tim-21, who's a companion robot for children. So he looks all sweet and innocent, but is he hiding a dark secret? We reviewed it in the podcast. I think we read the first volume a few years ago, and so I decided to go back and read the rest of it. And I must say, it's really good. The first volume ends on a cliffhanger, and I did want to find out what happened next. And I must say, certainly the rest of the story lived up to the sort of premise and promise of the first volume. So I've been enjoying it.
So have you now finished Descender?
I've got, I think, the last volume still to go, actually. Yeah. But I might have finished it by the time the podcast comes out. But I've nearly there, but it's very good,
Jeff Lemire is a writer I have a lot of time for. I think I may have done a recommendation segment about 10 episodes ago, maybe, in which my basic segment was the work of Jeff Lemire. It's great. And I stand by my statement. He's got a very natural, fluid touch to combining these sort of sci-fi concepts with quite believable dives into actual human feelings in a way that doesn't feel hokey for the most part. And I'm a big fan of his stuff, and the art here is gorgeous. So it's a good pairing. Yeah,
the art is absolutely beautiful. It's done in a sort of kind of looks more like a watercolor painting than what you'd expect from traditional comic art, which is different. And it's a very interesting approach, and it's a good, especially for like emotional scenes. The kind of this sort of slightly expressionistic style. I think really, really suits, especially the more dramatic scenes. And there's lots of the good sort of issues of the story when it'll go into one character's past and then you'll get their sort of backstory condensed into about sort of 20 pages or so, and there's always something interesting, there's always a twist, there's always something that really explains that's why that person's like that. And there's also there's loads of little things that kind of get thrown out at the beginning that you might gloss over thinking that's not really something significant, and it comes back later and will link into the plot in a sort of major way, which is kind of good how it all sort of links up like that.
I think that is what you said about characters is one of the things Lemire is good at. I think he writes characters in it's very immediately apparent how they are, and it's always both simple, and when he digs into it later, there's always quite a surprisingly nuanced explanation or backstory to it. He's got a very strong grip on his characters. It's one of these things where he's so good at it, he sort of feels almost natural and effortless. It's pretty impressive at times across a lot of his work.
He's a very good writer. Like you say, it feels effortless how sort of good he is at characterization. It's the character sort of seems to naturally form on the page, but I can imagine there's a lot of work that goes into making it look so seamless.
And there's a lot of, I always remember for Descender, my abiding memories of it, at least artistically, is these sort of huge montage scenes where everything just comes together into one busy but not crowded image of lots of things sort of hovering in the space, and it always looks incredibly cool because Dustin Nguyen is very good at drawing cool looking robots.
There's a lot of bits when the panel will just be a whole page of the comic, but then it'll kind of have loads of bits within it, it might be a dream sequence or memories or something like that, and it kind of just gets across how non-linear memories are or dreams are, but the smashing of collected images that kind of tell a story of a memory, but also in a sort of weird way where everything's blurring together, but it's also easy to follow and get the core information out of. So yeah, again, it looks so seamless and beautiful, but I can imagine a lot of work went into it.
Yeah, that's the point that I'm quite impressed that Descender has never been a series known for delays. As far as I know, it usually comes out roughly when he says it will. I think pretty much monthly. I think they usually do like a storyline, disappear for a couple of months to get ahead again, and then release the next storyline monthly, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
And of course, there is now a follow-up series, Ascender, which is I think more of a fantasy story set in the same universe, sort of post-robots, but I have not read that yet because I think the first collection only just come out.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed this, so yeah, in the future it'd be nice to read more of Jeff Lemire's work. So yeah, I think a few episodes ago you recommended another series that he worked on, so that might be something for me to pick up at some point.
Yeah, I think he's done a lot of good stuff. He's done a lot of day-to-day folk stuff, or slightly surreal day-to-day folk stuff, which is always pretty good. And I think he did a couple of other like sci-fi series as well.
Excellent. Yeah, so Descender comes highly recommended. Nick, do you have anything to recommend to our listeners?
Well, another revisit of a previous podcast topic. This is one I think we've covered several times actually. I've been finally watching the last season of Orange is the New Black, the Netflix prison drama. And yeah, I really like it. It's still really good. It's still one of my favourite sort of current premium telly shows. I stand by my recommendation to myself. It's good.
Yeah, it's one of the best things on Netflix. I haven't had a chance to see the final series, but the previous series have been very good, and they've been kind of consistently keeping the plot and the characters interesting.
Yeah, I guess I will play fairly loose with the plot spoilers then. But at the end of season 6, one of the sort of mainish characters got taken away by ICE, the old immigration authorities, and that becomes a major role. The corporation that owns the prison and has been getting involved with the plot for the last couple of seasons is going into immigration detention, and that will become more of a thing in the last season. And yeah, it's a bit of a bummer, to be honest. I haven't seen the last episode yet. I will have done, I think, by the time this goes up, so feel free to tweet me spoilers, because I should know them all by then. To be honest, the main overriding impression of Orange is the New Black is that it's both sad and impressive how willing they're willing to go hard bummer. I guess it feels like they've very much had a meeting and thought, well, we can't have a nice grace note of an ending because realistically, guys, we haven't solved the prison industrial complex. And it would probably feel a bit cheap and patronising to pretend we have. Although some characters I think are going to emerge not completely destroyed or basically alright, a lot of it is very much a song on the theme of, yep, still shit.
Yeah, and for a show that can at times be like quite light-hearted and quite funny, and there are some characters that are just kind of there for comedy value or quite silly, it can also be quite dark or quite upsetting at some point. I'm always impressed by how they could do these like handbrake turns from like one of the silly plot lines and into a bit that's like really like dark or quite sad. So yeah, the fact they can kind of balance it tonally, I think, is quite impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people that's probably the make or break on Orange is the New Black. Are you here for the frequent hard whiplashes from silly banter to, oh my god, that's incredibly depressing, again and again, often several times per episode? Do you think it's a little bit disrespectful, or just flat out do you find it quite uneven to watch? But I'm always here for aggressive swings from comedy to drama and back again, which may well be why it's one of my favourite shows. Even though I haven't seen the last episode, I'm going to go ahead and do my sort of final summary. But I don't think it's been a completely perfect run, but there have only been a couple of seasons which I think have wobbled a little bit. It's season 3 and season 5, in case anyone cares. And aside from those two, I think it's actually been alarmingly strong. Unless it really goes to shit in this one final episode I still got to see, I'm happy to call it one of the big TV triumphs of the current era. And if you're big on your premium telly and you haven't seen it, then I mean, I think you probably have. But in the event that you haven't, I would really recommend going back and starting it if you've got Netflix. It's a not just good but great show, I think.
Yeah, it is consistently good. I think it's worth going back to if you kind of lost enthusiasm with it, kind of in its sort of slow middle period, like around series 3 or something like that. Yeah, I think it is one of the best things that's on Netflix, and it's got such a broad cast of characters, and like every character again is like really well realized. Yeah, and like Descender, there's also like they'll do flashbacks into like a character's past, and then they always do such a good job of illuminating exactly why that person's like that or why they're behaving in that way. And the characterization is kind of the strength of it. Like again, they feel like real people, and yeah, that you can relate to them. Things like that. And obviously, and all the parts are very well played. They've kind of cast it very well.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of characters which you're always surprised how they've gone from being borderline jokes to some of your favourites or some of the most heartstring tugging characters.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, in some ways that's the trick. The more you laugh with them, the more you feel sad when the show starts kicking at them. You know, at the end of the day, it's about prison, a place where bad things routinely happen, so it very rarely feels entirely gratuitous.
Yeah, but it's set in, I thought it was an interesting decision that it's set in like a minimum security prison, or at least the early series are. And this isn't a show like Oz, for example, that's like set in a maximum security prison where like everything's just grim and everyone's just constantly just trying to murder each other and things like that.
The last couple of seasons they have moved over to max security, which is one way to amp up the stakes, I guess. And I'm glad that the last couple of series actually worked, especially as season 5 was interesting, but probably one of the ones that was a slight wobble. But the last couple of seasons, I think, have thankfully been quite a nice sort of final grim round with it. I'm as I say, happy to recommend the whole thing in retrospect.
First up, this episode, we'll be reviewing It, Chapter 2, the film adaptation of Stephen King's novel. When a series of gruesome murders hits the small town of Derry in Maine, 27 years after the previous film, the Losers Club must reunite to finally face their fears, hunt down and kill the shape-shifting monster called It, that frequently takes the form of murderous clown Pennywise. So this film just came out here in the UK, and we saw it recently. So Nick, what did you think?
Sort of low end's fine. Like, I'd feel bad giving it a proper shoeing, but at the same time, it's just kind of sort of maybe alright. It definitely felt like it drags a bit over 3 hours. The premise of these two films, It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2, for anyone who doesn't know, is that the book has two sort of interlocking narratives of the characters as kids and the characters as adults, and the films have just pulled them apart. So they're no longer taking place at the same time for the most part, except for a few flashbacks in the second one. So it's the kids in the first one and then the adults in the second one, and it's a way of handling it, and I'm not sure it entirely works. The adult characters feel a tiny bit thin, to be honest. Like, they don't seem to have as much emotional resonance as the kids. They mostly just kind of exist like they should have just been in a couple of flashback scenes to show what happens to them, and a whole film of them, especially a whole film that is a bit long. Like, this is, 2 hour 40, I think?
It's something like that, yeah. It is long, and it felt long.
It's long and it feels long. Like, it's not quite as long as Avengers Endgame, but it felt much longer. And, yeah, the characters feel a bit thin. The horror is surprisingly unscary, honestly. And, yeah, the middle part of the film was probably my favourite bit, and it's probably not a coincidence that was the part that contained lengthy flashbacks to the characters as kids, which felt a lot more emotionally real and engaged me a lot more than the adult stuff. There's a sequence where they split up and each go to a location, and it feels a bit checklisty in that it does this. Each one goes to a place and has a flashback and encounters a monster, normally the Pennywise clown, sometimes a different one, and then runs away. But it still engaged me the most out of the rest of the film. The beginning, it came together quite slowly, and the end was kind of the horror movie equivalent of one of those really over effects done superhero films. In fact, to be honest, it kind of felt a bit more like a sort of sci-fi fantasy kill the monster film than a horror film. Anyway, I've probably complained enough. The cast are pretty good, especially James McAvoy and Bill Hader. Jessica Chastain's pretty good as well, although I'm not sure she gets that much to do. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with all of that. It doesn't feel too much like a horror film. It's got some jump scares in it, and it's got some quite sort of gruesome bits, but I don't know, it doesn't have sustained tension that a horror movie has, like this kind of constant on edge state, which, even like other Stephen King adaptations like The Shining has, or other horror movies that we've covered on this podcast. So it doesn't quite have that sustained tension. I'm not sure if that's deliberate or just a failing of the film, because it feels more like it's a kind of fantasy adventure in that this group of people have to kill this like alien monster, and that's kind of the plot. And there are some like scary bits and stuff, and some like jump scares and bits when like nasty things jump out at you, or some quite gruesome bits, but they didn't scare me that much. And I think even after a couple of jump scares, you kind of become a bit immune to jump scares, which is a problem.
Yeah, well, you get the rhythm of them quite quickly. It's quite a sort of standard horror film sort of build, silence,
yeah,
sort of thing. And
every so often there's a bit when like there's like a curtain and there's like a noise behind the curtain and someone's like walking towards the curtain, and then you're like, okay, the tension builds, and then like they pull the curtain, and then you just know exactly what's going to happen. They pull the curtain aside, there's nothing there, and then something will jump on them from behind, and it's just like every time you're like, been watching horror movies for the best part of like 25 years, are kind of like used to that bait and switch. So it doesn't work so well. And they weren't really doing anything like original with like the horror. Because
it's so long, there's just a lot of those scenes just strung together in one long procession, and they're kind of just too similar to each other. I did feel for some of the characters, especially again McAvoy, Hader, and Chastain, who did nice enough jobs with the emotions in the bits they had. But yeah, they all went through something fairly kind of similar, and yeah, I don't know. I honestly feel like they could have. They kind of screwed themselves with this this structure they decided on, the one I described at the top of the segment, because it's just left them with a second film but kind of feels like a slightly trudgier reworking of the first film. Like, they're going to go to the same place and fight pretty much the same thing. And it's not as terrifying anymore because they're no longer kids, and the clown is increasingly familiar. I gather in the book they kind of handled this by going a lot higher on the batshit scale with the monster. Something to do with an evil demon and a turtle.
Yeah, which I guess they left out of the film because maybe they thought it would be too over the top or too silly. And there are some moments when I did laugh at the film, and obviously I don't know if that was intentional.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of ours who is more familiar with the book described the book version of the plot to us in the pub afterwards. I guess I won't spoil it beyond what I've already said, but just in case anyone out there is in the middle of reading it. But I feel like they've landed on the wrong side of the go hard or go home dilemma with the silly stuff of the book. Like, they've played it kind of conservatively and really left there's a few bits of the silly stuff in there that feel like they're just kind of in there as vague concessions to the book and aren't really very well explained, and the rest of it just feels a bit flat.
Yeah.
But I started off by saying this is low end fine, but I'm sort of talking myself down a bit from even that, to be honest.
I mean, so in order to, I guess, say some nice things about it, like I say, I thought there was some good performances. As you said at the top, I thought Bill Hader was very good. He's like mainly a comic character. He seems to do a lot of comedies and things like that. And the character he's playing in this is like the Joker of the group when they're kids has grown up to become like a stand-up comic. And they clearly cast someone who's a comic and can do the funny parts, and then obviously then has to do the dramatic stuff. But I thought he was actually very good. He was pretty convincing in the scary and emotional scenes.
He's also good in Barry, the HBO show I recommended a few episodes ago, where he also does a good swing between the comedy and the jokes. So yeah, most people probably don't need me to tell them this, but Bill Hader, he's good. And
yeah, James McAvoy is good, and this is not the worst film this year to star James McAvoy and Jessica Chastain. I mean, it's like a low bar to clear, but it is. This film is better than X-Men: Dark Phoenix.
It is, although weirdly, James McAvoy was one of the more engaged, better parts of that film. But yeah,
but he's good in this film, and he does what he does very well. He's like believable in the role, and I thought Jessica Chastain was very good with what is quite a thin part. There's not much to the adult characters. They're just kind of like sort of slightly grown up, tweaked versions of the kids. And I don't know if the book goes into like more detail about their adult lives, but you don't really get a lot of them. They've each got like basically one thing about their adult life that's like a problem, and it usually gets discarded quite early on. Like the Jessica Chastain character's got an abusive husband, but she kind of just leaves him in the first scene, and it's never really mentioned again.
That was flat out weird.
Yeah, I can imagine that's again more of a thing of the book, but the book is very long, so I can imagine like it's something you could do like a lot about like her, trying to get over the emotional trauma of like leaving her abusive partner and the emotional trauma of like their relationship, but also trying to deal with this like murderous monster they have to face and kind of blend the two together. But I guess the film is quite long, and so there's just not really done that. There's like very, very little of it. And yeah, what I was kind of surprised by the second one is how much the kids were in it from the first one. There's like a lot of flashbacks. They're not just repeating scenes from the first one. They're like new scenes with the kids. I guess because the majority of the story is about the children or when they're children. So there's a lot of them in the second one as well as the first one. They just leave less time for the adults in what is already like quite a long film.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, they must have had time to write better material for the adults, surely. And yeah, Jessica Chastain leaving her partner in the first scene and then it just not being mentioned was also kind of weird. It's one of these things which the book is a gigantic brick of a thing, and maybe he had time to go into it in a bit more detail. But it just all comes across as one of these sweeping, huge cast epics, which might have been good as a novel, but it as a film kind of ends up not having enough time. It's hard to tell whether the problem is that they've got too many characters and not enough time, and they were better characterised in the book, or if in the book everything was merged together and the adults just weren't in it as much and were basically just thin versions of the kids, as you say, which is kind of an argument for just making a more faithful adaptation, just making one quite long film instead of two medium to long films, and just splicing everything together and cutting back and forth, which, having seen both films, I now kind of feel they should have done.
Yeah, I think that would have been better. And also, one of the things that kind of, I think, didn't work so well is that one of the premises that in this film, so everyone's grown up and moved away from Derry apart from one of the kids, Mike. And all the ones who've moved away have basically kind of forgotten what happened and forgotten about the monster. And then as they come back, they sort of slowly remember what happened. Now, in the book, obviously, you're reading like the plot lines side by side. So you're reading about like a grown-up coming back to their childhood small town, and then their childhood memories coming back to them. And then you see, that memory play out. And I guess it's kind of, there's something interesting there about like how memory and how, memory is linked to location, and, how you change when you move away and you change when you get older, but also you're still the same person. And there's stuff going on there, and there's an element of suspension because someone's like,
what are they going to find out next?
Yeah, exactly. What are they going to find out next? Well, the problem is we've already seen it because we've seen the first film. So like when you see it in chronological order, the suspense of the fact that they can't remember their childhood is just completely gone. They do add some suspense by basically putting in scenes about their childhood that we haven't seen from the first film. But I think I can imagine it would sort of work quite well if you had like Bev, the Jessica Chastain character. She leaves her abusive husband. She goes back to her hometown that she can't remember. Then she remembers she had an abusive father. And there's something about cycles of abuse there. And there's also, there's an element of suspension and horror. But we know what her relationship with her father is like because we've seen the first film.
Yeah, and I guess they couldn't really have saved all the abusive father stuff for the second film, because that would have left her with nothing to do in the first one.
Yeah, I mean, that's just an example, but the point is, like, it kind of deflates the tension.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. It's just one example of how this structure kind of sort of doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. As the kids say. Was that it?
Next, we will be discussing how do you cram a novel into a film. It is a famously difficult novel to adapt, and from the review section you can tell there are some flaws to this adaptation. So what are the lessons to learn from this process of trying to get a huge sprawling novel into 1 or 2 films? How do you cram a novel into a film? Nick, any thoughts?
Well, to be honest, I think it should be less of a cramming and more of an aggressive chainsawing. I think there kind of needs to be a concession that the two forms are very different, and especially if you're doing a straight one-to-one novel into film. Or, in general, I probably usually better to just excise a load of stuff and produce a simpler film, rather than try and reproduce the original structure or create some sort of sprawling epic. Like, the Harry Potter films, to use a grade A obvious example, yes, read other books, I know, had 8 films. Which is quite a lot for a single story.
Yeah.
And they still, a lot of the time, felt like sort of edited highlight selections of the books.
Yeah, certainly the early ones I felt there was an issue when they were really like, we've got to get all of this stuff in that people like. And later on, I think they kind of dialed it back a bit.
Yeah, I think later there was maybe a bit more, later there was a bit more effort to turn in something that was a bit more coherent. The first few Harry Potter films, I really felt like you might be a bit, why would I ever like this if I haven't read the book? There's nothing to this except seeing the stuff on screen. It just feels like all you've done is taken a lot of nuance and connective tissue out. And in it, they've kind of left a lot of that in, but ended up, I don't know, I think a lot, with it, I think they've kind of ended up blandifying it a bit, to be honest, which is, I guess, the downside of chainsawing stuff out. It's trying to identify things that would make the film compelling to people who didn't like the book, which I don't think they've really done.
No, I think you kind of need to find like the essence of what it is you want to bring out in like and adapt into the film. Trying to find out what is like the core of the story, or what is like the emotion that I want to like the book achieves, or like the character that the book achieves that does quite well in the film. And I think the problems with it is that they've kind of gone for 2 things. When like they basically like, this book's quite scary, so we want this film to be quite scary. So they've got like the horror in it, yeah, and they've also got like this book has this kind of like really like solid group of relatable characters, and is a great like evocation of childhood, and they've kind of like tried to bring that over. And this problem is there's not enough room to kind of get all the characterization in for 7 main characters, and then also build like and sustain a sense of horror in something that is like much shorter than a book. So I felt they kind of should have chosen one or the other. They should maybe just like gone lighter on characterization, make the characters more iconic but have it more scary, or I don't know, make it just more about the characters and less about the horror. But I suppose you kind of want both things for your It adaptation.
Personally, I think they should have crammed it into one film, quite heavily gutted the adult stuff, because the child stuff clearly works better. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just that they didn't do it well in this version, but I felt we could have done a bit less of the expository, it's an alien stuff with the monster, because that felt like a sort of halfway house between explaining too much and explaining too little. Like, I still feel like I don't really know anything, but everything you have explained makes the monster feel less interesting and less exciting.
But yes, that's probably trying to be a bit too faithful to the book. I think one of the issues with a lot of film adaptations is just trying to be too faithful to the book. Like, the film should be like a thing in its own right. And also, I think on some level you have to recognize that you can't be that faithful. I think from when I used to write films, films, none of them ever got made, but I used to write film scripts. And the average film script is kind of like, I don't know, in the sort of 10 to 15,000 word mark. And obviously, like, a lot of novels are kind of like around the 100,000 word mark. Now, obviously, a lot of films, like, film script, there's like, you're not fleshing in the details the way that like a novel is. Like, you don't need as much prose and things like that. And obviously there's going to be visuals and performances to convey a lot of the stuff that you have to convey in prose in the novel. But novels, then again, just that bigger scope gives you more of a range to have like more characters, more details for characters, more scenes, longer plots, and trying to press all that down to like a film can be a problem.
Well, yeah, and in terms of raw medium, novels are more of an internal medium. You don't have to dramatise what happens, because you can, if necessary, just have 1,000 words of prose about the character's tormented mindset, and if you're a good enough writer, you can pull that off.
Yeah.
Whereas in film, unless you're making some sort of wibbly floating colours on screen abstract masterpiece, you probably have to actually dramatise it so something actually happens.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've talked about these as well. Long overdue, MFV Klaxon. There's the three types of conflict: the personal, interpersonal, and extrapersonal conflict.
Drink.
Yeah, everyone drink. I've done it again. Books are really good at the personal conflict. That's kind of the medium they sort of excel at, which is like kind of, you can take you inside a character's mind and show you what's like kind of going on inside their head. And obviously you can do that in film, and like the best films that do that, but like it's easier to do that in a book. And film is like a medium that's really great for extrapersonal conflict between characters and society. Yeah, or characters against the environment. That's why like kind of war films work really well, because you can like bring war to life, or like disaster movies, horror, action things work well on historical epics, because you can bring all this extra personal conflict to life. And for those who are counting, the best medium for the one I've not talked about, interpersonal conflict, is probably the theatre. When you've got the theatre is very much about relationships between characters.
Yeah, I don't know. I think possibly the film, I mean, come back to it, even though we're meant to have finished reviewing it, didn't really dramatise it that interestingly. It was just a lot of people going to places and standing around having flashbacks, which may well kind of be what the book is as well, but it felt a bit static and weird in the film.
Yeah.
I flicked through a few lists of best books of film adaptations to do this sequence, and predictably I haven't seen most of them. The Shining seems to be the most listed Stephen King adaptation.
Yeah.
That and Stand By Me, both of which I gather are not that faithful, and do cut and cram quite heavily to get the plot into a film in a different form.
Yeah. Stand By Me, I think, sums up one thing that we've kind of hinted at, which is that Stand By Me is a short story called The Body. One of the things I think we've learned is that short stories and stuff can often make a better adaptation to films than novels do, because they're smaller and they're kind of usually focused on like one or two characters, which works well for a film. I think The Shining works well because they basically, Kubrick, I think, decided what he wanted from the book, which is like a scary film from a scary book. And a lot of the sort of like background mystical stuff that's in the book, it's in the film, and like, but it's like dialed down a lot, and it's really not much the focus. Obviously, famously, Stephen King himself hated Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining and how much it wasn't faithful to the book, and he famously did his own TV adaptation of The Shining, which is supposed to be appallingly bad, though I've not seen it, and kind of makes Kubrick's case that like, yeah, all the things we're talking about, which is like, don't be super faithful to the book, find what you like about the book and like translate that into film, and leave out other stuff where necessary.
A book adaptation which I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see pop up on these lists I was looking at was actually The Hunger Games, which does have to do, although superficially it does just adapt the premise fairly straight, it does actually have to do a reasonable amount of adaptation, because those books are written in a sort of aggressively internal, close first person with the main character Katniss.
Yeah.
Have you read the novels, The Hunger Games?
No, I have not read the novels, but you can spoil them I'm sure our podcast listeners have.
I mean, I'm not going to aggressively spoil them. Plot-wise, to be honest, if you've seen the films, they're quite similar.
Yeah.
But in terms of how they're told, the third novel is basically a sort of very, very, very internalised depression journal, as Katniss's mind kind of shuts down a bit from all the horrible things that have happened to her.
Yeah.
Like, very, very large chunks of that book where she just doesn't leave the rebel base thing, and all the action basically happens off panel while Katniss has a breakdown. And I gather it's a polarising book, because it's not really as, action-packed and fun as earlier ones. It's very much from the, but if this meant horrible violence actually happened to you, school of sequel. It's very much a sort of turnaround on people who thought they were reading this for, visceral thrills. But yeah, the film kind of had to provide some visceral thrills, so it does, change the thrust of the novel quite a lot to actually include some action sequences and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's quite a good film series, The Hunger Games, and one of the reasons is because it does, where necessary, make changes to the storytelling in order to accommodate the fact that it's no longer in this sort of super close first person.
Yeah, they've changed it a lot to make it work as like a film and things like that. I think they added various things that like the commentators to the Hunger Games who like explain a lot of the stuff that we need to know for the plot. That obviously Katniss can just tell us in her head and things like that, and also things like it is very closely focused on Katniss, played very well by Jennifer Lawrence. They have taken the fact that basically these novels are about this one character and their experience, and they've made like the films about this one character. I think there's barely a scene that she's not in for the whole thing. So it might be there's like one or two, I think. But yeah, it is very much focused on her, yeah.
It's not a sprawling novel. I guess it doesn't suffer from that much from a need to cram. If anything, a lot of the time they probably needed to expand it.
Yeah, and the films are also, they're not too long and stuff and things like that.
They did expand the third book into 2 films, but somehow it still works.
Yeah, there's been a sort of a vogue for that. I don't know if it's just something like Harry Potter started.
I think it's now ended, happily.
Yeah, and I think it was just to get more
Money.
film, more film for your book. Like they did the same with Twilight, didn't they? They did the same with Hunger Games. I guess it started because like The Deathly Hallows is again quite a long book, and they didn't want to like really aggressively compress it down to one film. And I think also just it breaks quite neatly into 2 halves.
It just about works in Deathly Hallows. I still think those films are a bit long and spacey, but it just about works.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the 2 mirroring examples of good bad film adaptations in the form of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Yeah, I was going to come into those. Yeah, which is like The Lord of the Rings. Obviously, is like his enormous book available in like kind of 3 volumes, all of which are like enormous as well, and like. They did I mean, they're long films. They're all like over 3 hours, but like they did do a good job of like chucking out loads of stuff. I mean, Tolkien is like a famously like sprawling writer. Songs that go on for pages, enormous like descriptions that just run and run and run. I mean, there's a bit when it's like we walked, we saw a tree, we walked, we saw a rock. A king once touched that rock. Here's the entire history of that civilization. All of that can be obviously cut or compressed quite easily.
I mean, I'm not enough of a Tolkienologist to know exactly how much they cut or didn't cut in Lord of the Rings. I don't know whether they did just cut a lot of superfluous description and leave all the plot, or if there is also quite a lot of concatenation of characters and storylines to get it into 3 coherent films. But that is obviously one of our big book-to-film success stories, and The Hobbit, conversely, although less due to cramming and more due to needless expansion, was not.
Yeah, The Hobbit is like quite a short book, and the fact they made it into 3 films is ridiculous. But they just like threw stuff at it that wasn't necessary, like things from the appendices and stuff and bits like that.
I mean, to be honest, that's probably less adapting The Hobbit as a book and more adapting The Hobbit as a media property. Like, I don't get the feeling that was a similar issue to it. I think that was less bad adaptation decisions and more bad decisions as a whole.
Yeah, I think so. The whole kind of premise was quite flawed and things like that. And obviously, there's like extended cuts of Lord of the Rings, which are like you push the films like 4 hours, and you can get lots of extra scenes and things like that, like stuff that they cut. And they have, even despite those, they have like compressed characters and simplified bits. But like I say, the book is there's a lot of like subplots and meanders in the book, like famous as like Tom Bombadil, this kind of bit which it kind of fleshes out the world a bit, but isn't really necessary for the plot. And if you want to sustain the pace of like cinema, then it's the sort of thing that's like good to cut.
Yeah, another one that came up vaguely in my research was Trainspotting, which is a film I have seen, but a book I have not read, so I don't know to what extent they cut, compressed, and slashed down Irving Welsh's book. But it does work very nicely as a film, mostly because they got the very charismatic actors and did a good job of dramatising a few scenes that brought their characters across very cleanly. Like, I don't know whether the book is a lot more sort of rambling and internal, or contains a lot more detail about their lives. I genuinely have no idea.
Yeah, the book is more like written in the first person, and it's written in Irving Welsh's sort of like Scottish dialect, and it is very much like an internal sort of, one of those like sort of experience novels when you see the world through like a character's eyes, and which is again why like the film uses like loads of like voiceover and things are lifted from the book. For Trainspotting, one thing they did also help is that the film is actually based on a play adaptation of the book.
Okay,
I think,
so someone's already done the dramatising.
Yeah, so there was kind of a translation from book to stage and then stage to film, which is interesting because the film itself has loads of stuff that I guess you couldn't really do on stage, like, again, spoilers for Trainspotting, Like the dead baby crawling on the ceiling, which would probably just look a bit crap in the theatre, or like when like he falls through the carpet, or like when he goes down the toilet to get his enema back and things like that. It's like the kind of slightly dream-esque bits of the film. I don't know how well they would have worked on stage. So again, they've made it like a film in its own right. And that's the sort of, again, it's very visual, so I don't know. That's not the sort of thing that would work so well in a book. So they found a way to make the film like work as like a visual property. You know, it has things that only can be done in a film, which is what makes it like a good film, and the book is things that can only be done in a book. Another example of good adaptations, I don't know if I've told this story or discussed this before on the podcast, is like when there's like the book or something was like unfinished or not particularly good, or there's problems with it. So a great example is The Godfather. Mario Puzo was like writing the novel, and he wanted to do another draft, but it got accepted by a publisher, and he had gambling debts to the mafia, according to the story, and he didn't dare rewrite the book in case the publisher didn't take it and he didn't get paid. When Francis Ford Coppola came to make the film and he got Mario Puzo to write the screenplay with him for the book, there's a sense that like Mario Puzo got to do the final draft he always wanted to do on the story and make it better. And also they cut like a lot. Like I think it's quite a rambling novel, and they cut quite a lot of the subplots and like focused it down specifically on the Corleone family.
Yeah, I haven't seen The Godfather, but that is also on the list of best book to film adaptations. But it sounds like it's one of the ones like, I don't know, Blade Runner, where the film's quite different in the end.
Oh yeah, Blade Runner's an interesting one. That's another one. I've read the book and seen the film. There's a lot of extra stuff in the book. Again, there's this whole thing about how they have like electric animals that they look after, and there's like the world is fleshed out. There's some very odd bits in the book that I can see why they cut for the film. And also in the book, he has to hunt down about 8 replicants, whereas in the film, it's only 4, which, again, they kind of just like truncated the plot and like combined lots of replicants together and things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing that makes Blade Runner work is kind of a lot of the time it's the visuals or the atmosphere of it that you sort of marinate in. So I think the appeal there is to sort of slash down as much of it as possible so you can have these sort of long humming scenes.
Yeah, and there's like they've kind of just like got rid of loads of stuff from, which is also like quite a short novel, or stuff that would really struggle with like there's lots of religious stuff in the book that I think would be a bit odd, and much more details about the society, but they kind of like focused it down to like just this essence of the story, like this man or possibly replicant who hunts replicants, kind of distilling the essence of it, and not being super faithful to the book. So I think that there's an example that worked well.
So yeah, in short, streamline. Pile it down to the bone, but not in a bad way.
I think don't be too faithful. Yeah, don't make it too long, obviously, things like that. Try and find the essence of what worked in like the book and then translate that into a film rather than try to take like the whole thing and stuff like that. And just acknowledge that you're going to have to cut, unless it's a very short book or a very impressionistic book.
Well, yeah, I think there has to be a willingness to sort of go your own way and become your own thing at some point. I think I get the feeling it ended up kind of stuck in the middle, wanting to make changes, but also seemingly not willing to make big changes.
Yeah.
Producing what's ended up being a sort of middling, not great film.
Yeah.
Although the first one, the first one's still quite atmospheric and watchable. It's got some good emotions and good scares. To be honest, you could probably quite happily watch it without watching the second one. But maybe do that.
Yeah. Maybe that's what we've learned.
Yeah, we've done like 20 minutes on how to cram a novel into the film, and the moral of the story is don't watch it, chapter 2.
And that brings us full circle.
Okay, and that was it. Thank you for listening to Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you want more Moderate Fantasy Violence, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where we have essays, old episodes, old cutscenes from episodes, all sorts of Moderate Fantasy Violence. And if you particularly enjoyed all of that, you can then go to various podcast providers and leave us a nice review so that more people can join the party. Thank you.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at Alastair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryant. You can find out more about me and my comics and my writing of books and such at nickbryan.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at nickmb. And if you came to Hackney Comic and Zine Fest, thank you very much. It hasn't happened as of this recording, so I have no idea if you did or not. And in 2 weeks' time, we will be back, at which point we will have watched the whole of Amazon's new superhero-bashing TV show, The Boys, and we will be able to, well, we may or may not bash it, it depends. See you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you want more Moderate Fantasy Violence, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where we have websites. Well, we have a website, yeah, man.